Just after I dropped my son off at the airport, my housekeeper of 12 years called, her voice shaking. She said, "Sir, pull over. Before you go home, you need to check your security camera." I pulled up the live feed, and my blood ran cold. My wife of 24 years was standing in our garage, smiling, as two absolute strangers crawled under my truck. They were carefully attaching something meant to ruin the rest of my life. And then, I saw my own son walk into the living room, the same son I'd dropped off at the airport less than an hour ago. Before I go on, I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Your country, your city. I love knowing who is here with me in this community. It means everything to me. As a quick note, a few fictional elements have been woven into this story for narrative and reflection. Any resemblance to names or places you know is purely coincidental, but the lesson it carries is entirely yours. The drive from our place to Nashville International Airport usually takes about 35 minutes, depending on the traffic on Interstate 40. It was a Monday morning in early October, and the roads were wide open. The sky was that crisp, pale blue that only shows up when Tennessee summers finally decide to take a break. I had the radio turned way down, playing an old Merle Haggard song I'd heard 1,000 times. Nothing serious was on my mind, just whether I'd remembered to roll the recycling bin down to the curb. Preston was in the passenger seat, his carry-on wedged between his feet, scrolling on his phone like he always did. 31 years old, my boy. Somewhere along the line, he'd stopped being the kid who'd fire off 100 questions on a car ride and turned into a guy who just stared at a screen. "You sure you got everything?" I asked. "Charger, wallet, all of it." "Got it, Dad," he said, not looking up. "What time's your flight again?" 10:15? I nodded, tapping my thumb against the steering wheel to the rhythm of the music. "Weather in Denver should be nice this week. Mid-50s, maybe some bout." I checked. That was how it felt. What? That was how it felt with Preston lately. Every conversation was like filling out a form already submitted. Short answers, distracted eyes, a kind of practiced patience. Like he was just waiting for me to finish speaking so he could get back to whatever was actually important. I told myself it was just how adult kids get with their parents. Back then, I told myself a lot of things I don't believe anymore. I pulled up to the curb at Terminal C departures and shifted into park. Before I even pulled the emergency brake, Preston had his door open. "Hey." I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Call your mother when you land." "Will do. You know how she gets." He paused for half a second. A pause you wouldn't even register, unless you were looking back on it later. Then he smiled. "Yeah, of course. I will. Call me too. Doesn't have to be long." "I will, Dad." He stepped out, slung his bag over his shoulder, and stood on the curb looking back at me through the open door. For a second, just a second, he looked 8 years old again. Same square jaw, same dark eyes, standing on the edge of the school bus steps, like he didn't quite want to go. "Love you, son," I said. "Love you too." He shut the door. I watched him go through the automatic glass doors until he was lost in the crowd. Then I pulled back into traffic and took the exit ramp. The Merle Haggard song was over. Some new song I didn't know started playing, so I reached out and turned the radio off, deciding quiet was better. 31 years. 31 years of being a father, and every time my kids turned away, there was still that slight ache in my chest. Lorraine used to laugh at me for it. "Jean, He lives 20 minutes away, she'd say. You act like he's going to see. Lorraine. My wife of 24 years. She was fast asleep when we left the house that morning. One hand tucked under her pillow, the way she always slept. Before we left, I had kissed her forehead, and she mumbled something sweet. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked, how much she belonged to my life. I was almost back to the on-ramp for Interstate 40 when my phone rang through the truck's speakers. The name on the display said, Dot. That's what everyone called Dorothy Webb, the woman who'd been keeping our house in order for 12 years. Dot was 65, a grandmother of 3, and not a woman to call without a good reason. I answered, Morning, Dot. What came through the speaker wasn't a greeting. It was breathing. Shallow, fast breathing. The kind a person makes when they're trying to hold themselves together and not quite managing it. Dot. My hand tightened on the wheel. What's going on? Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough around the edges like she'd been crying. Don't come home. Please, don't come home yet. The hair on my arm stood up. What happened? Are you hurt? I'm not hurt. She caught her breath, shaking. But you need to pull over right now, and you need to look at the security camera app on your phone. 2 years ago, after a string of break-ins in our area, I'd put in a security system. 4 cameras total: front porch, back patio, kitchen, and garage. The app let me see a live feed from anywhere. I'd checked it maybe a dozen times since it was installed, mostly to see if the courier actually left a package or just marked it delivered. Dot. My voice was steadier than I felt. Tell me what's happening. Please, she said, and that simple word cracked down the middle like a weight she couldn't carry. Just pull over and look. I can't say it, Mr. Jean. I can't say it out loud. You need to see it. I didn't signal, just took the next exit and pulled the truck into the parking lot of a MAPCO station. I parked under an overhead light that flickered with a faint buzz in the morning quiet. Around me, regular life was moving right along. A woman in scrubs was pumping gas. A teenager on a bicycle rode past. A guy in a John Deere hat walked out with a coffee and a lottery ticket. My hand was steady when I unlocked my phone. My hand is almost always steady. 68 years of a mostly quiet life, some hard times, but I learned a long time ago that shaking hands don't fix a thing. I opened the camera app, clicked on the garage feed, and felt my stomach completely drop. The picture on my screen was grainy, the familiar concrete floor. The pegboard on the far wall with my tools hung up. Neat and tidy, just like my father taught me. The old workbench in the corner with a coffee can full of screws I'd been meaning to sort through for 2 years. Everything was right where I'd left it this morning, except for the 2 men I'd never seen before in my life. One was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a dark jacket, moving with a kind of casual ease. The ease of a man who knows he shouldn't be there and has decided not to care. The other was shorter, heavier set, with tattoos running up his neck under his rolled-up sleeves. They weren't looking through things. They weren't even in a hurry. They were moving around my garage like they were taking inventory. Dot, I said softly, my voice dropping low. The way it gets when things are very bad and I can't afford to raise it. Who are those? Men. I don't know them. She was still whispering, and I could hear something fragile in her voice. Anger, maybe, or fear, or both mixed together. They came about 20 minutes after you left. Mrs. Lorraine let them in herself. My thumbs swiped to the living room camera. There was Lorraine, standing by the sofa, talking to someone just out of frame. She was smiling, Not the polite smile she used for repairmen or contractors, but a warm, genuine smile. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I switched back to the garage feed. The tall man was kneeling by my truck. The 2019 Ford F-250 I bought myself as a retirement present. He was doing something down near the rear tire. His shoulders blocked the view, but his arms were reaching underneath the frame. A few seconds later, when he stood back up, his hands were empty. "My lord," I breathed. "Mr. Jean," Dot's voice broke. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police before I called you. I just didn't know." "You did right," I said. "You did exact right. Where are you?" "In my car down the street." I left out the back door when I heard them drive up. I don't think they saw me. "Good. Stay there. Don't go back in the house." My eyes were locked on the garage feed, watching the tall man pull a rag from his jacket pocket to wipe his hands. Leisurely. Unbothered. "Can you describe the tall one?" "Hair. Anything you notice?" "Reddish hair. Maybe 40. Driving a dark SUV. Georgia plates. The other one, the short one with tattoos, came with him. Georgia plates." I stored that detail away, cold and precise. On the screen, the two men walked back toward the door that leads from the garage into the house. The tall one said something that made himself laugh. A real, easy laugh, like a man with not a single care in the world, standing in someone else's garage on a Monday morning. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then something made me swipe back to the living room feed once more. That was the moment my heart didn't just drop. It stopped altogether. Walking down the hallway, hands in his pockets, wearing the olive green jacket I'd bought him for his birthday last November, was Preston. My son. The son I dropped off at Nashville International Airport less than 40 minutes ago. The son who told me his flight was at 10:15. The son who said, "Love you too," closed my truck door and walked through those glass doors. "That's not possible," I said out loud to the empty truck, to the buzzing light overhead, to a normal Monday morning that had pulled off its tracks without warning. The timestamp in the corner of the camera feed said, 10:38 a.m. Leave. Preston walked into the living room like he'd never left. Lorraine turned to him, said something I couldn't hear, and he nodded. Then the tall man with the reddish hair came through the hallway, right behind him. Lorraine put her hand on his arm. "Not the way you touch a contractor. Not the way you touch a stranger." That simple gesture rewrote everything I thought I knew about my life. My chest felt like someone had reached in, grabbed everything inside, and squeezed hard. "Dot." I had to clear my throat to get the words out. "The man, the tall one. Has he been to the house before?" The silence before she answered told me everything I needed to know. "Yes, sir." Her voice dropped even lower. "A few times, maybe more. I thought he was Mrs. Lorraine said he was married to someone in her book club. I didn't ask questions. I should have. "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it, even with my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching it. "None of this is on you." I saved the footage from all 4 cameras, then forwarded copies to my personal email address. Old habit from 30 years in contracting. Documentation saves you. Memory fails you. Secure the evidence first. Figure out what it means second. Don't react until you know the full shape of what you're facing. I got out of the truck, walked to the back, and knelt down, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the frame near the rear driver's side tire. My knees popped, complaining, like they always do. I ignored them. It took me less than 30 seconds to find it. A small package wrapped in black plastic, zip-tied to the frame behind the exhaust pipe, about the size of a large sandwich bag, placed carefully, hidden well. I didn't touch it. I stood up slowly, holding on to the tailgate to steady myself, looking around the MAPCO parking lot, watching the woman in scrubs drive away, watching the teenager on the bike long gone, watching the man in the John Deere hat walk off with his scratch-off, carrying on with his ordinary Monday. My eyes burned, but not with tears. Something drier, harder than tears. I pressed 2 fingers to my lips, took a deep breath through my nose, and held it until the feeling passed. Whoever these men were, whatever Lorraine had brought into our home, they had a plan. When the police pulled me over, and they were going to make sure the police pulled me over, what they found under my truck would end everything. My freedom, my reputation, the house my parents built, every quiet detail I'd spent 68 years putting together. My phone was still in my hand. I scrolled to a name that had been in my contacts for 30 years and hit dial. It rang twice. Carl Hutchkins answered, his voice sharp and clear. As a man who knew me, he knew I didn't call before noon unless something was wrong. "What's happened?" "I need you," I said. "Right now. I need you at the MAPCO on Donaldson Pike, and I need you to bring a pair of work gloves." I took one last look at the package under the truck. "And Carl, don't tell anyone where you're going." Carl Hutchkins pulled into the MAPCO parking lot 14 minutes after I called, which meant he'd broken the speed limit at least twice and hadn't stopped to ask a single question. That was Carl, 66 years old, built thick, with the kind of hands that had done 40 years of honest work, which he had, running his auto repair shop on Murfreesboro Pike since 1987. He climbed out of his pickup, wearing a faded Tennessee Titans hat, already wearing his work gloves. Because when Gene Stafford calls before noon asking for work gloves, Carl Hutchkins doesn't waste time wondering why. He took one look at my face, and his jaw tightened. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need you here before I touch anything." Without a word, he walked to the back of my truck, knelt down with the ease of a man who'd spent half his life under vehicles, and lit up the frame with his flashlight. It took him about 10 seconds to find it. The light stayed steady on it for a long time. "Gene." His voice was flat and careful, the way a man talks when he's keeping something heavy under control. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." "I can't tell you that." My throat felt like sandpaper. "Because I think it's exactly what you think it is." Carl stood up slowly. He adjusted his gloves, reached back under, and with the practiced hand of someone who had undone decades of tangled things, freed the package. He held it up in the pale October sunlight. A package the size of a sandwich, wrapped tight in black plastic, sealed with zip ties. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," he said quietly. "This wasn't slapped on. Someone took their time." My stomach turned. I watched them on the camera. He was under there for 30 seconds, maybe less. He's done this before. Carl placed the package carefully in the metal toolbox in the bed of his truck, closed the lid, and locked it. Then he turned to face me. The look on his face was one I hadn't seen since his eldest daughter got into real trouble, and he showed up at my front door at 2 a.m. because he had nowhere else to turn. "Did you call the police?" he asked. "No." "Good." He pulled off one glove and pointed it at me. "Don't. Not yet. If you call them before you know what you're dealing with, you lose control of the whole board. You hear me?" "I hear you." "Who else knows?" "Dot. She's the one who called me." I rubbed the back of my neck where a slow headache was building. She saw them arrive, saw Lorraine let them in. Carl pressed his lips together, turning his gaze toward the gas station, where a mother was trying to wrestle a toddler back into a car seat. Normal life moving right along, completely unconcerned that mine was falling apart in a Mapco parking lot on a Monday morning. And Preston, the name felt heavy in my chest. He's at the house. I saw him on the camera. My voice was remarkably steady. 40 minutes after I dropped him at the airport. Carl turned back slowly. His eyes searched my face for a second. Then he blew out a breath through his nose and looked down at the asphalt. Son of a... He stopped himself, running a hand over his chin. Jean, I'm sorry. Not time for sorry yet. I picked up my phone from where I'd laid it on the hood. I need an attorney. Not tomorrow. Not this afternoon, now. Someone who handles more than just divorces. Frank Delgado. Carl said the name without hesitation, like a name he'd kept in his back pocket just in case. He handled my cousin's mess 3 years ago, when a contractor tried to frame him for an accident on a job site. Sharp as a razor, doesn't mess around. And he won't be rattled when you walk in and tell him what you just told me. He was already pulling out his phone. I'll call him on the way. You're not driving anywhere. I'm fine, Carl. He gave me a look that was equal parts concern and complete disbelief. Jean, you just found out your wife let 2 strangers into your garage to put something under your truck. And your son, who's supposed to be on an airplane, is sitting in your living room. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, steady and solid. The hand of a man who'd been my friend since we were young and dumb enough to think we knew everything. You are not fine. You're holding it together, which is different, and I respect it. But you're not driving. The tight wire in my chest gave just enough for something real to bleed through. 24 years, Carl, I said. I know. I kissed her forehead this morning. I know that too. His hand gave my shoulder one brief squeeze, then let go. We handle this the right way. Evidence first, reaction second. Right. I nodded, taking in a deep breath of October air, exhaust fumes and all, and forcing myself to stand tall. One more thing. Carl was already moving to his driver's side door. The video. Keep it safe. Emailed it to myself the second I saw it. All 4 angles, timestamps intact. For the first time since he'd arrived, Carl's face softened just a fraction. Almost a smile, but heavier. Still the same Gene Stafford who kept every receipt from 30 years of contracting. He pulled the door open. Get in. Frank's office is on Charlotte Avenue. We can be there in 20 minutes if we move. I climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. As Carl backed out and turned onto Donaldson Pike, I watched the road ahead, the same road I'd driven Preston down less than 2 hours ago. With cold, absolute certainty, I knew that whatever came next was going to require every ounce of patience I'd learned in my 68 years. Because the worst thing I could do right now was make a move before I saw the whole board. Frank Delgado's office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on Charlotte Avenue that looked like it had been standing, since Nashville was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be. The frosted glass on the door said Delgado Law Offices, Criminal and Civil Defense. Below that, in smaller letters, by appointment only. Carl walked straight in. The receptionist, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked up from her keyboard. Sir, we don't take walk-ins. Tell Frank it's Carl Hutchkins, Carl said smoothly. And tell him it's urgent. She picked up the phone with the look of someone who'd learned not to argue with a certain kind of older Southern man. She spoke softly into the receiver, then looked up, her eyes slightly wider. "He'll see you now." Frank Delgado was 58, lean, with close-cropped silver hair and dark, alert eyes that made you feel like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. He came out from behind his desk to shake my hand. Firm, brief, no drama. He pointed us toward 2 chairs across from him and skipped the small talk that lesser men use to fill up space. "Carl says it's urgent." He sat back in his chair, hands folded on the desk. "Talk." So, I did. I gave it to him in order. The drive to the airport, Dot's call, the video, the package under the truck. Seeing Preston walk down the hallway like he'd never left. I kept my tone level. I didn't add commentary. Frank listened without moving, writing nothing down, his eyes fixed on my face the whole time. When I finished, the silence in the room had a weight to it, the kind of quiet that happens when someone is working through a problem, not just waiting for their turn to speak. "The video," Frank said. "Is it saved off the device?" Emailed to myself the moment I saw it. All 4 angles, stamped with the time. A slight change went across his face. Not quite approval, but close. "Good. That matters more than you know right now." He reached for a legal pad. The package under the truck. "Carl's holding it, locked in my truck's toolbox. He wore gloves. We didn't open the wrapping." Frank nodded slowly. "Smart. Chain of custody is everything. If that material is what you think it is, how it was handled from the moment you found it becomes part of the whole picture." He wrote something down. "Now, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it straight. Ask. Do you want to save this marriage?" The question hung between us. Carl shifted in his chair beside me. "No," I said. "Then we don't do this by halves." Frank put his pen down and looked at me dead on. "Mr. Stafford, what you're describing goes way beyond a domestic dispute. If someone placed illegal contraband under your vehicle, with the intention of ensuring law enforcement found it during a traffic stop, that's criminal conspiracy to forge evidence. In Tennessee, that's a felony." He let that sit for a second before continuing. "But what concerns me right now is this. Before we bring in law enforcement, I want to know exactly what kind of trap they've already built around you. Because in my experience, something like this doesn't get planned overnight." He turned his computer monitor toward me. The screen showed a login page for a joint bank account management portal. "Can you log into your shared financial accounts?" he asked. "I should be able to. We set them up together. Log in." I leaned forward and typed in the credentials I hadn't used in almost a year, back when family finances were something Lorraine managed. I'd trusted her with it the way I'd trusted her with everything else, completely, without question, because that's what 24 years of marriage is supposed to mean, or what I thought it meant. The account loaded. Frank leaned in, looking closely at the screen. Then he picked up his legal pad, wrote a number down, and slid it across the desk toward me. I looked at it. The edges of my vision went strange. The way your brain reacts when it receives information it isn't ready to process. That's the balance in your joint savings account right now. Frank's voice was cautious, level. I want you to tell me if that matches what you expected to see. The number on the pad was $4,211.16. There was over $160,000 in that account, I said. The words came out flat, like reading off a card someone else had written. About 14 months ago, last time I checked. Carl made a low sound in the back of his throat. Frank nodded, as if he'd already expected it. Intend to see if a spouse systematically moves marital assets out of joint accounts before filing for divorce. That's considered fraudulent dissipation of marital property. It means they intentionally drained assets legally owned by both parties to deprive the other spouse of their fair share. He tapped the pad with his pen. That's actionable in civil court, and depending on how it was done, it can carry criminal liability. She moved it somewhere, I said. Not a question, a statement. I'll find out where the money went. Frank was already typing. But Mr. Stafford, what I need from you right now is to go home tonight, eat dinner, watch TV, and act like a man who knows absolutely nothing. He looked up from his screen. Can you do that? My jaw set. Thinking about sitting across the dinner table from Lorraine, passing her the salt, asking her how her day was. It felt like being asked to swallow glass. I've been married 24 years, I said. I can do a lot of things I don't want to do. Frank almost smiled. Almost. Good. Because the moment they think you know, the structure they've built disappears, and I intend to see every single piece of it before that happens. He turned the monitor back toward himself. Carl can bring me the secured evidence tomorrow morning. He slid a business card across the desk. If anything changes tonight, call this number. Doesn't matter what time. I took the card. It read Frank Delgado, plain text, no fancy design. I liked that about him. One more thing, Frank said. Something in his tone made me look up. The number I showed you, that account balance. He paused. That wasn't the only account I looked at. Without any setup, Frank turned the monitor back toward me again. Just like a doctor showing you the X-ray when the results are bad. Because sugarcoating doesn't change the facts. The screen was showing a transaction history for our joint brokerage account. It was an account we'd set up 15 years ago on the advice of a financial planner at our church, who told us we needed to be smarter about planning for retirement. Lorraine took over managing it about 2 years later because she had a better head for numbers than I did. Or so I thought, and I was happy to let her handle it. The balance at the top of the screen read $1,847.33. There was $82,000 in that account, I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. Last time I looked, 14 months ago, it had $84,400, Frank said. He scrolled down through the transaction log slowly. I watched line after line of withdrawals roll past. Every single one was between $4,000 and $9,000. Every single one was spaced 2 to 4 weeks apart. Every single one was labeled with descriptions like portfolio, rebalancing, or personal transfer. Whoever managed this knew exactly what they were doing, Frank continued. In the U.S., federal law requires banks to file currency transaction reports for any cashed transaction over $10,000. It's called the Bank Secrecy Act. By keeping every withdrawal under that threshold, they avoided triggering an automatic report. Structured withdrawals, Carl said beside me, his voice tight. Precisely, Frank nodded toward him. Technically known as structuring. Ironically, structuring itself is illegal under federal law, but proving intent in a case like this takes time. He stopped scrolling at a transaction from 8 months ago. $9,000, marked personal investment transfer, dated 3 days after Easter Sunday. Do you remember anything unusual around this date? Easter? I thought. Back. We'd had Preston and Nicole over for dinner. Lorraine made her mother's recipe for glazed ham. I sat at the head of the dining table I inherited from my father, feeling like a genuinely blessed man. No, I said, the word tasting like chalk in my mouth. Everything seemed fine. Frank printed out the complete transaction history, 4 pages, front and back, and placed it on the desk between us. Then he pulled up a second window. This is your joint checking account. The balance there was slightly higher, just over $12,000. But the withdrawal pattern was identical. Careful, continuous, patient. My hands rested on my knees, and I pressed them down hard to keep them from shaking. Because my hands do not shake, and I certainly was not going to start now. Where did the money go? Where skew? I asked. To an account in Chattanooga, registered under the name Patricia Wills. Frank looked at me. Does that name mean anything to you? That was Lorraine's mother's name. Something burning hot rushed through my chest, only to turn cold just as fast. Her mother passed away 4 years ago. Frank's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew sharper. This account was opened 11 months ago. The registered address is a post office box in Chattanooga. Whoever opened it used Patricia Wills' social security number and a copy of her ID. He paused, letting the information sink in. Mr. Stafford, that's identity fraud. Opening financial accounts using a deceased person's identity is a federal offense. The room felt much smaller than when I had walked in. I looked out the window behind Frank's desk at the afternoon sun over Charlotte Avenue in Nashville. People outside were going about their business, cars, pedestrians, everything moving along in an orderly rhythm. I remembered 11 months ago, Lorraine sitting at our kitchen table going through mail while I watched the evening news, asking if I wanted another cup of coffee. She spent 14 months setting this up, I said, almost to myself. At least, Frank said. What I've found so far is only from accounts I could access with the credentials you provided. There may be others I haven't reached yet. He leaned forward slightly. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Around 8 months ago, did anything change? Did Lorraine seem different? Any changes in behavior? Did she mention anything about finances or the future? I searched my memory honestly. 8 months ago, March, maybe April. The weather was warming up. I spent my weekends fixing the backyard fence, while Lorraine started going to yoga classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She seemed lighter, happier. I thought she was just enjoying the warmer weather and the exercise. I thought it was good for her. She seemed happier, I said, those words hurting to say. I thought it was a good thing. Carl let out a long, slow breath through his nose beside me without saying a word, but it said everything. It likely was a good thing, Frank said quietly, for whatever she was planning. He closed the browser window and turned the monitor back around. Here is where we stand. You have video footage of 2 men accessing your vehicle without consent. You have a physical piece of evidence secured. You have 14 months of financial records showing fraudulent dissipation of marital property and potential identity fraud. He tapped his legal pad with his pen. Now, I need you to give me time. 2 to 3 days before law enforcement steps in, so I can build a complete chain of evidence. You said that before, I replied, my jaw tight at the thought of going home and acting like nothing was wrong. I know I did. His voice was steady but firm. And I'm saying it again, Jean. It was the first time he'd used my first name since I walked in, and it hit me with unexpected weight. You have more evidence right now than most people bring into my office after months of investigation. Don't ruin it by acting too soon. I stood up, my knees aching as usual. Whenever I sit too long, they remind me that 68 isn't 50, and whatever battle is coming, I'm going to have to fight it in this aging body. All right, I said. 2 days. Frank stood up and extended his hand. I'll call you first thing tomorrow morning. His handshake was just like when I came in. Firm, brief, no unnecessary movement. In the meantime, keep your camera app open. If there's any movement in that house, I want to know about it immediately. I shook his hand, turned, and walked toward the door. Carl fell into step alongside me. We walked through the waiting room, down the narrow stairs, and out onto the street. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut low across Charlotte Avenue, casting long shadows between the buildings. I stood on the sidewalk, taking in the October air. The smell of exhaust, Thai takeout from 2 doors down, and the faint scent of rivergrass from the Cumberland a few blocks away. Carl stood beside me in silence for a moment before speaking. You holding up? I'm still standing, I said. That's enough. It had to be enough. At 5:47 p.m., I pulled into my driveway. Before heading inside, I sat in the cab of the truck for a full 90 seconds as the engine ticked and cooled down. Not out of fear, but because I needed to make a deliberate decision right then. Who was I going to be the moment I walked through that door? Certainly not the man who had watched the security footage. Certainly not the man who had sat across from a lawyer, watching 14 months of theft roll across a computer screen. I needed to be the man Lorraine thought she'd married, steady, trusting, so consumed with his own routine that he missed everything happening right under his nose. Having spent 30 years managing construction contracts, I knew that saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could cost you a $500,000 project. I knew how to hold my poker face. I pushed open the front door, and the aroma of food hit me instantly. Beef stew. The kind Lorraine made with carrots and pearl onions, a dish I had always genuinely loved. The TV in the living room was on at a low volume, playing one of her home renovation shows. Jean, is that you? Her voice came from the kitchen, perfectly normal, warm, and steady. It's me. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook I'd used for 20 years, and walked into the kitchen. Lorraine was standing at the stove, stirring my mother's old Dutch oven. She was wearing a blue sweater I recognized, her hair styled the way she did when she went out. She turned and smiled at me, and as I looked at her face, the same face whose forehead I'd kissed that morning, I felt an emotion I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't hatred. It was something heavier and older than hatred. Long day? She asked. Long day. I pulled a bottle of water from the fridge, giving myself a moment to turn away. Traffic coming back from Donaldson was a disaster, as usual for a Monday. She turned back to the stove. Dinner will be ready in about 40 minutes. Oh, Preston called. My hand tightened on the water bottle. Oh, yeah? Did he land? He did, said. The flight was smooth, sounded tired though. She adjusted the burner under the pot. You know how he gets when he travels for work. Yeah, I said. My voice coming out smooth, warm, and entirely fake. The ease with which the deception flowed surprised and unsettled me. I walked over to the dining table and unfolded the newspaper, even though I'd read most of it on my tablet that morning. I held it up in front of me, looking at the print without reading a single word. I listened to Lorraine moving around the kitchen, the clinking of a spoon against the pot, the sound of cabinets opening, the soft sigh she made as she bent down to check the lower oven. Familiar sounds of 24 years. I knew them as well as I knew the creak on the third step of the porch, or the clatter of the furnace in February. Dot called me this afternoon, Lorraine said. Behind the newspaper, Every muscle in my body braced, but my hands remained rock steady. "Everything all right with her?" I kept my voice light. She said she wasn't feeling well and might not make it in on Thursday. Lorraine set 2 plates on the counter by the stove. I told her not to worry about it. She works too hard for her age. She does, I agreed. I thought about Dot sitting in her car down the street that morning, her hands shaking, as she called me, because she couldn't turn a blind eye to an injustice. Because some people are built so that when something is wrong, they can't look away. I used to be that kind of person. I didn't know when I'd stopped paying close attention to the things going wrong in my own home. We ate dinner at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals. Lorraine talked about how the gutters needed cleaning before winter, about a woman in her book club whose husband had been diagnosed with something, and about whether we should repaint the front porch come spring. I responded in all the right places, asking a follow-up question whenever a silence stretched out. The stew was as delicious as ever, and I ate 2 full helpings, because doing anything less would have shown a flaw in the act. After dinner, I washed the dishes just as I always did. Lorraine cooked, I washed. A rule we'd set in our 3rd year of marriage. I stood at the sink with my hands in the warm water, looking out the window at the backyard. The old oak tree, the flower bed Lorraine had put in 6 summers ago, the fence I'd rebuilt myself last spring with lumber I'd personally selected. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I dried my hands and checked it with my back turned to Lorraine. It was a text from Frank. Checked the property records. Call me when you're alone. Don't wait until tomorrow morning. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished wiping the stove. Lorraine walked in to refill her water glass, standing so close, her shoulder brushed against mine. "You seem quiet tonight," she said. "Just tired." I folded the dish towel and hung it over the oven handle, just as I'd done for the last 20 years. "I think I'll step outside for a walk before it gets completely dark, clear my head." "Don't stay out too long." She squeezed my arm gently before turning back to her show. I put on my jacket, walked out the front door, down to the edge of the driveway, and called Frank. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Gene." His voice had an urgency it hadn't carried that afternoon. "I found something in the county property records. Something I didn't expect." The oak tree at the corner faded into the dimming light. "Tell me, your house," Frank said. "The house your parents built in 1971. It's been listed as pending sale for 17 days. The listing agent is a man named Dale Corbin, licensed under a brokerage co-owned by Ray Coulter." After Frank hung up, I stood on the sidewalk outside my home for a long time. The oak tree at the corner had gone dark against the evening sky, leaving only a silhouette. The neighborhood was carrying on with a typical October Monday evening in Tennessee. Porch lights coming on, a dog barking 2 streets over, someone calling their kids inside for dinner. Normal life surrounded me like furniture in a room I no longer recognized. My parents built this house in 1971. My father poured the concrete for the front steps himself. My mother planted the rose bushes along the east wall the spring we moved in, and they had bloomed every May for 54 years. Lorraine knew all of this. She had sat at our dining table listening to those stories. She had held my hand at my mother's funeral as the casket was lowered. And 17 days ago, she had listed this house for sale without saying a single word to me. I put my phone back in my pocket and walked back inside. Lorraine was on the sofa, feet tucked under her, watching her show with a cup of chamomile tea on the side table. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. "Feel any better?" I sat in the armchair across from her. Not next to her on the sofa, where I usually sat, but where I could see her face clearly. Nice night out. Leaves are changing. I know. I was thinking we should drive out to Montgomery Bell Park this weekend to see the colors before they fall. She held her teacup with both hands. We haven't been in years. Sounds nice, I said, not believing a word. I stared at her face, searching for a crack, a slip, anything, but found nothing. That was when I realized just how long she had been practicing. I went to bed at 10:15 p.m. Lorraine came in around 11, sliding into bed quietly as she always did when she thought I might be asleep. I lay on my side, facing the window, listening as her breathing slowed into a steady rhythm. Once I was sure she was deeply asleep, I reached over, grabbed my phone from the nightstand, and opened a browser. Raymond Allen Coulter, 45. Last known address. Marietta, Georgia. Carl had given me the basic details that afternoon, but I needed to know more. In the dark, I spent 40 minutes reading everything I could find. Property, records, business filings. A 3-year-old article from the Savannah Morning News about a civil suit that was settled out of court, its details sealed. The suit involved a woman named Constance Beaumont, 63 at the time, who accused a financial advisor of helping orchestrate the fraudulent transfer of her marital assets during a divorce. The advisor's name had been redacted in public records, but the case number matched the Georgia records Frank had mentioned. Ray Coulter had done this before. He had sat across from another woman in another city, telling her whatever she wanted to hear. When it was over, Constance Beaumont walked away from a 22-year marriage with a fraction of what she was owed, while a sealed court record protected the man who facilitated it. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The anger was there, resting on my chest like a heavy stone. But beneath it was an emotion I hadn't anticipated. Something closer to grief. Not grief for my marriage. Between the MAPCO parking lot and Frank's office, I had already accepted that my marriage had ended long before I noticed. The grief was for the Lorraine I had trusted for 24 years. The woman who cooked beef stew in my mother's Dutch oven, who talked about painting the front porch, who said, "Drive safe," every time I left the house. That woman had been real once. She had to be. No one can fake it right from the start. I remembered Frank asking when things had changed. Lying there in the dark, I found a clearer answer than the one I'd given in his office. About 18 months ago, Lorraine started going to yoga on Tuesday and Thursday nights. She seemed lighter, happier. I'd thanked God privately, because the years prior had been tough. Her mother's passing, a restless energy in her she couldn't shake. I'd worried about her in the quiet way a husband does when he doesn't know how to ask. Ray Coulter had walked right into that restlessness, and I'd been so relieved to see her happy again that I never bothered to ask why. I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum, where the stone sat, and took deep breaths until the pressure eased. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A text notification from an unknown number, no name attached. I tilted the screen toward me and read it in the dark. "Mr. Stafford, this is Nicole, Preston's wife. I need to talk to you about something. Please don't call me back tonight. Please don't tell Preston I texted. I'll explain tomorrow. I'm so sorry, Nicole. My daughter-in-law. Married to Preston for 3 years. A quiet young woman from Clarksville who taught second grade, baked Christmas cookies every December, and always seemed a little nervous around our family. I'd always assumed that was just her personality. I read the message 3 times. Then I turned the phone face down and stared into the dark. Something in that text. The apology at the end, the explicit request not to tell Preston, told me that whatever Nicole knew, she had been carrying it alone for a while, and the weight had finally become too much to bear. Tomorrow, then. I closed my eyes, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, and waited quietly for Tuesday. At 6:45 a.m. on Tuesday, I left before Lorraine woke up. I left a note on the kitchen counter, as I sometimes did. Out for coffee and a drive. Back by 9, disappearing without an explanation would break routine, and keeping the routine intact was everything now. I drove to the Cracker Barrel on Old Hickory Boulevard, ordered a coffee at the register, and took it out to my truck, parking in the far corner of the lot, where I had a view of the road in both directions. The morning was overcast and cold, with low clouds moving fast overhead. A few retirees in matching windbreakers walked into the restaurant, and a young mother struggled to get a stroller out of her minivan. Nobody paid attention to a 68-year-old man sitting alone in a Ford pickup, his coffee slowly growing cold in the cup holder. I dialed the number Nicole had texted from. It rang twice before she picked up, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Stafford. Nicole. I kept my tone steady and warm, because she sounded like she was standing on a ledge and needed to hear a firm voice. Are you somewhere you can talk? Preston went for a run 20 minutes ago. She took a shaky breath. He always runs for 45 minutes. I've been watching the clock. The fact that she was timing her husband's runs to make a secret phone call said more than her text had. Take your time, I said. Start wherever you need to. She was quiet for a moment, gathering herself. About 2 months ago, I saw a text on Preston's phone. I wasn't snooping. He'd left it face up on the kitchen counter, and a notification popped up. Before the screen went dark, I saw the name Ray. She swallowed audibly. At first, I didn't think much of it, but a week later it happened again. And what I saw was enough to know it wasn't a normal conversation. What did the text say? Timeline moved up. Make sure the old man's schedule is clear that week. Her voice turned tight, repeating those words. I confronted Preston that night. He got angry, not guilty, just pure anger, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. He claimed Ray was a business contact and told me not to worry about it, but you kept worrying. I couldn't stop. She let out a quiet sob. 3 weeks ago, I found a folder in Preston's office drawer. I wasn't looking for it. I was just getting a stapler, and it was right there. Inside were property documents. For your house, Mr. Stafford. Your property on Elmwood Drive. Her breathing hitched. One of the documents had a signature. Your signature. But it looked off. I've seen your signature on Christmas cards. I know what your handwriting looks like. My hand tightened on the phone. What did you do with the folder? I put it back. Then I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes because I didn't know what else to do. Her voice broke. I thought about calling you 100 times, Mr. Stafford. I want you to know that. But Lorraine, she controls so much of our lives. Our apartment rent, some of Preston's work contacts. I was terrified that if I spoke up and was wrong, or if Preston found out. You weren't wrong, I said gently. And you were right to be careful. A sharp intake of breath came over the line, as if the reality of confirmation had struck her physically. Preston doesn't know everything, she said, the words now rushing out. I don't think he knows all of it. I've been watching him. The way you watch someone when you're scared of what you'll see. He's been nervous lately, not confident like he is when he's in control. Every time his phone rings, he flinches. He isn't sleeping. She paused. I think he's in over his head and he's terrified to step back. That information stirred a complex mix of feelings in my chest. The father in me and the wronged man were pulling in opposite directions. Nicole, I need to ask you something important. I kept my voice level. The folder you found, is it still in that drawer? I checked yesterday. It's still there. Can you take photos of every page without Preston knowing? She thought for a moment. He works until 6 p.m. today. I can do it today. Only if you're certain he won't come home early. Only if it's completely safe. I meant it. I wasn't going to let this young woman put herself in danger over a few pieces of paper. And Nicole, if at any point you feel unsafe, stop. You don't owe me anything. You're wrong about that, she said, her voice unexpectedly quiet and firm. A long time ago, Preston told me a story. When grandfather died and your family needed money for the funeral, you sold your truck to cover it because you didn't want your parents asking anyone for help. When he told it, he acted like it was just a simple fact about you. She took a shaky breath. For the past 2 months, I've held on to that story, trying to make myself brave enough to make this call. My eyes stung for a brief second, a sudden heat behind my eyelids, but I blinked it away before a tear could form. You are brave, I said. Making this call proves it. She let out a faint sound, almost like a laugh that didn't quite make it out. I'll send you the photos this afternoon. And Mr. Stafford, last night, I heard Preston on the phone in the garage. He didn't know I was awake. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. He said, Saturday morning, that's the day. Saturday is 4 days away. Thank you, Nicole, I said. Go back inside, act normal. Can you do that? I've been acting for 2 months, she said. I'm getting better at it. She hung up. I held the silent phone, staring at the cold coffee in the cup holder as the overcast Tuesday morning drifted past the Cracker Barrel parking lot on Old Hickory Boulevard. Saturday morning, 4 days. I started the truck and set off toward Dot's house because I still needed one final piece of the puzzle. And I was beginning to realize Dot had been holding on to it all along. Dot lived on Caldwell Lane, a short street sitting behind a Baptist church whose marquee sign always featured something worth reading. That Tuesday morning, it read, Truth does not require your permission to exist. I paused at the stop sign in front of the church longer than usual. Hers was the third house down. White aluminum siding, green shutters, 2 chairs on the concrete porch, and a ceramic rooster that had been sitting there for as long as I'd known her. The planter under the front window was still full of the season's last petunias, looking a bit worn down now, but holding on all the same. That was Dot's way, holding on long after most things would have given up. She opened the door before I even made it up the porch steps. She'd clearly been watching for me. When she saw my face, her composure broke for a fraction of a second before she pulled herself back together, holding on to the dignity of a woman who had cried in private and cleared her eyes. Come on in, she said. I put coffee on. Her kitchen was small, warm, and smelled of cinnamon and dish soap. She poured 2 cups without asking how I took mine, having brewed my coffee every Thursday morning for 12 years. We sat across from each other at her small table with its yellow vinyl chairs. For a moment, neither of us reached for our cups. Tell me what you saw, I said. All of it. Don't leave anything out to spare my feelings. Dot clasped her hands around her cup. They pulled up at 10:43 a.m., she said. I know because I looked right at the microwave clock. A dark SUV with Georgia plates pulled right onto the lawn instead of the driveway, like they owned the place. Her jaw tightened at that. Mrs. Lorraine opened the door before they even knocked. She was dressed up, her hair done, like she'd been waiting for them. How did she greet the tall one? Dot met my eyes without flinching. She put her hand on his arm. Not a handshake. Not a hello. Come in. She put her hand on his arm and smiled at him like... She stopped, pressing her lips together. Like a woman who was finally seeing someone she was glad to see. The coffee cup in my hands was warm. I focused on that warmth. They went to the garage first, Dot continued. All three of them. I couldn't see inside from where I was, but they were in there for about 8 minutes. The short one, the one with the tattoos, stayed in the garage when Mrs. Lorraine and the tall one went back inside. She paused. That was when I got in my car and left, Mr. Barr. Jean, I didn't want to spend another minute in that house. Something in my gut told me to move. You were right to leave, I meant it deeply. Dot, how long have you been noticing things that seemed off? She looked down at her cup. A while, she whispered, maybe 3 months. The tall man, he's been to the house before. I've seen him 3 or 4 times, Mrs. Lorraine always said he was married to someone in her book club. I didn't ask questions. She looked up, her eyes shining with something close to tears. I should have asked. What they did isn't on you. No, she said, her tone showing she didn't fully believe it. But I carry responsibility for seeing things and saying nothing. She stood up abruptly, the way people do when they can't sit still, and walked over to the kitchen counter. She opened the drawer next to the sink, the one where she kept batteries, rubber bands, and odds and ends, and walked back to the table. She set down a small gray USB flash drive. Last year, someone stole my bicycle off the front porch, she said. A brand new birthday gift to myself. So, I put a small camera under the eaves. If you don't know it's there, it just looks like a birdhouse. She pushed the drive across the table toward me with one finger. Before you came by this morning, I pulled the footage from the past 2 weeks. The angle on that camera, she paused, points right at your garage, Mr. Jean. You can see the driveway, the garage door, and the first 6 feet inside when the door is open. I picked up the flash drive, holding it in my palm. It's all on there, she said, including yesterday morning. My throat tightened. Dot. I set the drive back on the table and looked her straight in the eye. I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand it clearly. She sat up straight in her chair. 15 years ago, I said, when Marcus was in Vanderbilt Medical Center after his accident, and the surgeon told you he needed a procedure insurance wouldn't cover, and you had 4 hours to come up with $28,000. I watched her expression shift, watching the memories cross her face. I didn't do it because I expected something from you. I didn't want to pay back. I didn't want to pay back. I did it because Marcus was 22 years old, and money should never be the reason a 22-year-old kid doesn't get a surgery he needs. That's the whole of it. Nothing else. Dot's jaw trembled. She pressed her fingers tight against her lips, taking deep breaths through her nose until she had the feeling under control. You never mentioned it to a soul, she said, her voice gravelly. Not even Mrs. Lorraine. No. I always wondered why. Because it wasn't a favor, I said. It was just the right thing to do, and doing the right thing doesn't need an audience. She reached across the yellow vinyl table and placed her hand over mine. A 65-year-old hand. A 65-year-old hand. A hand that had cleaned my house, washed my dishes, and kept my life running without a word of complaint. She gave it a hard squeeze, the way people do when words lose their edge. Marcus is a respiratory therapist now, her voice cracked. At Vanderbilt. He's been there 8 years. I know, I smiled at her. And I know he's good at it. She gave my hand one last squeeze, let go, and leaned back in her chair. You take that flash drive to whoever needs to see it, and you tell me what else you need me to do. Anything at all. I picked up the drive, my fingers closing tight around it. One more thing, I said. Frank Delgado, my attorney, needs you to tell him what you told me this morning, word for word. Can you do that? I can do that, and I can look anyone in the eye who needs looking at, she said without a second of hesitation. I believed her completely, because in 12 years, Dorothy Webb had never looked away from a single thing that needed facing. I finished my coffee, thanked her, and walked through her kitchen, down the porch steps, past the ceramic rooster and the faded petunias. I got into my truck and sat there, looking at the drive in my palm for a long moment. Then, I dialed Frank. On Wednesday morning, Frank's office on Charlotte Avenue looked entirely different in the sunlight. Brighter, more ordinary. The kind of place you'd drive past 100 times without a second glance. Carl was already there when I arrived, sitting in a chair in the waiting room with a paper cup of coffee from down the street, flipping through a fishing magazine that looked 2 years old. He looked up when I walked in, raising an eyebrow at the flash drive in my hand. "Dot's camera," I said. He set the magazine down. "You've got to be kidding me. Under the eaves, shaped like a birdhouse?" Carl looked at the ceiling for a second, the expression of a man re-evaluating someone he thought he'd known inside and out. "I've been underestimating that woman for years," he said. Frank walked out of his office before the receptionist could even call him in, meaning he'd been waiting on us. He took the flash drive, stared at it for a second, and led us back to the conference room where a laptop was already open on the table. The video loaded in under a minute. Frank pulled his chair close to the screen, leaning in. We watched together. The dark SUV pulling up at 10:43 a.m., the Georgia plates showing as clear as print in the morning sun. Lorraine opening the door before they even hit the steps. The tall man with the reddish hair walking into the garage with a comfortable, familiar ease. Then came the shorter man, thick-set, left arm covered in tattoos from wrist to elbow, moving to the rear of my truck. The angle on Dot's camera caught what my own system missed. You could clearly see his left hand working underneath the frame behind the wheel well. 15 seconds. Practiced, unhurried, like a man doing a job he'd done a dozen times before. Frank paused the video right on the short man's face. Grainy, but clear enough. Square jaw, heavy build. A distinct scar through his left eyebrow that would make him easy to spot in a lineup. "Chuck Merritt," Carl said. Frank looked up at him. "Ray Coulter's associate. I had someone run that SUV's plate last night. Registered to Coulter. But Merritt's been tied to him since that Georgia deal. Same circle, different hands." Frank looked at Carl with the same quiet reevaluation I'd seen on his face Monday morning when I told him about my footage. "You had someone run the plate." "I run an auto shop," Carl said flatly. "I know people." Frank turned back to his laptop, making a note on his legal pad. "This footage, combined with your own system's capture, gives us 2 independent camera angles, recording the exact same incident. That is massive." He tapped the pad with his pen. "What I need now is to place Ray Coulter on your property in person. Merritt's on video, but Coulter is the architect. I want him on tape." He looked at me. "Your living room feed. How clear is it?" "Clear enough to see the expression on Lorraine's face," I said. Frank nodded. "Then we have him inside the house. That's solid." He closed the laptop. But what I really want is independent verification placing his vehicle at your address. Something that doesn't come from your system or DOTS camera. A third source. He paused. You mentioned a neighbor across the street. Eleanor Stubbs, I said. 72. Sits on her front porch most mornings. Then, let's go talk to Eleanor Stubbs. She answered the door in a burgundy cardigan, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, holding a library book with a bookmark tucked into the last quarter. Behind her, the house smelled of coffee and baked goods, and a small TV in the front room was playing the morning news on low volume. She looked at the three of us on her porch with bright, unbothered eyes. A woman who had seen most forms of life and found them more interesting than alarming. Jean Stafford, she said warmly, opening the door wider. You brought company. Eleanor, sorry to drop in without calling, I said. This is Frank Delgado, my attorney. You know Carl. Carl fixed my Buick 3 years ago, she said, stepping back to let us in. Did a fine job. Come on in. I just brewed a fresh pot. We sat in her living room. She took the wingback chair by the window, a spot that gave her a straight shot right across the street to my house. We took the sofa. Frank explained concisely that I was handling a serious legal matter and that any observations she'd made from her porch could be a huge help. Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the side table with precise care, taking a second to give the question proper thought. The dark SUV, she said. Georgia plates. That's the one you're asking about. Frank leaned forward slightly. You noticed it. I notice every car that parks on this street, she said, without apology or boast, just stating a fact about herself. I've lived here 31 years. I know every vehicle that belongs, and I know every vehicle that doesn't. That one didn't. She looked at me. It was there Monday morning, but that wasn't the first time. I saw it twice last week, Tuesday and Friday, if my memory serves. Parked right in front of your house for about an hour each time. Did you happen to catch the plate number? Frank asked. Eleanor gave him a look of patient, slight disdain. I wrote it down, she said. She stood up, walked over to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, and came back with a notepad. Written in neat, practiced handwriting was a Georgia license plate number, along with 3 dates and approximate times next to each. Frank looked at the notepad, then looked at me. Behind those careful eyes was a spark that, if he were a man given to showing emotion, you might call satisfaction. Mrs. Stubbs, he said, would you be willing to make a formal statement regarding what you observed? Eleanor picked her coffee cup back up. Young man, she said, in the tone of someone long past youth and entirely unawed by it. I've been waiting for someone to ask me about that since Monday morning. She turned her head toward me. Jean, your father was a decent man, and so are you. Whatever's going on over there, I want to help put it right. My throat tightened. Thank you, Eleanor. She waved a hand as if it were nothing, though it wasn't. Then she refilled our cups, and Frank went to work taking notes. On the drive back to Charlotte Avenue, Carl's phone rang. He listened for 30 seconds, then hung up. He looked over at me from the driver's seat, his face set hard. That was my contact, he said, the one who ran the plate. He paused. Ray Coulter's got a record, Jean. Not just that civil case in Georgia. Frank needs to hear this. When Carl and I walked back into Frank's office, he was on the phone, talking in the sharp, efficient shorthand of a lawyer who bills by the hour even when he isn't. He held up a finger, finished the call, and set his phone down on the desk like he was organizing his thoughts. Sit, he said. Both of you. He turned his monitor around. The screen showed a scanned legal document header from the Superior Court of Chatham County, Georgia, dated March 2019. The case title at the top read, Beaumont v. Beaumont, with a second defendant listed below, Raymond A. Coulter, individually and in his representative capacity. The civil case in Georgia, Frank said, wasn't the only proceeding Ray Coulter was involved in. He pulled a printed sheet from a folder by his keyboard and laid it flat on the desk, facing us. In 2018, Coulter was arrested in Cobb County, Georgia, on charges of conspiracy to commit unlawful transfer of property and unlawful transfer of property. The charges were reduced during a plea agreement, and he served 14 months in a minimum security facility in Georgia, getting released in early 2020. Carl sucked in a breath through his teeth. So he's done time. 14 months. Frank confirmed. Saw. Convicted on the reduced charge, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. 3 other counts in the original indictment were dropped as part of the deal. He tapped the paper. The victim in that criminal case was a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher in Marietta. Her husband of 19 years hired Coulter as a financial transition consultant to help manage assets during a divorce. Frank's voice remained level, but something deep in his eyes turned to stone. When the dust settled, she lost her home, her retirement account, and her share of the proceeds from the sale of a vacation property. Coulter took a cut of every single transferred fund. The room felt dead quiet. Outside on Charlotte Avenue, a truck rumbled past, and a few blocks away, someone was using a leaf blower. Life carrying on, its ordinary business. While I sat in a Nashville lawyer's office on a Wednesday morning, finally understanding that the man inside my house, inside my life, inside everything Lorraine had built behind my back, had done this before. He had taken the lessons from his first round, refined his method, and gone right back to work. He got smarter, I said. Frank looked at me. Yes. The Georgia criminal case involved crude financial transfers that left a paper trail a first-year law student could follow. What's been done to your accounts over the last 14 months is far more sophisticated. Smaller amounts, a longer timeline, better documentation, cleaner cover. He paused. He used his time to perfect his process. My jaw was set so tight my back teeth ached. And Lorraine doesn't know any of this. Almost certainly not, Frank said. That fits his pattern. Neither did the husband in Marietta. Coulter sells himself to the spouse as a partner, an ally, someone who's going to help them finally get what they deserve out of a failing marriage. The spouse provides access to the house, financial records, and relationship dynamics, while Coulter designs the structure. He folded his hands on the desk. Your wife opened the front door for him, Jean, but I don't think she understands that the man she let in has done this twice before, and walked away with the money both times. I thought of Lorraine standing at the stove last night, stirring the beef stew in my mother's Dutch oven. I thought of her squeezing my arm in the dark hallway before bed. I thought of how good she was at the act. The everyday warmth, the seamless cover. I wondered how much of the last 18 months had been real, and how much had been the practiced ease of someone who'd already decided how it was going to end. I didn't have answers. I wasn't sure I wanted them. Here's where we stand, Frank uncapped his pen. We have video surveillance from 2 independent sources. We have financial records showing systematic, fraudulent transfer of marital assets. We have a property listing agreement with a forged signature. We have a physical piece of evidence currently sitting in Carl's toolbox that needs lab analysis to confirm its nature. And now we have a documented history showing that the primary outside player in this situation has a prior conviction for the exact same conduct. He looked at me squarely. What we're missing right now are the photos of those files in Preston's drawer that Nicole promised us. She said she'd send them today, I said. The moment you hear from her, forward everything to me. He capped his pen. I've been in contact with Detective Sarah Okafor at Metro Nashville Police. She handles financial crimes and has 11 years of experience investigating asset fraud. I've given her an initial overview without specific identifying details. She wants a meeting, but I told her Thursday afternoon at the earliest. I want Nicole's photos in hand before we sit down with law enforcement. 2 days. Carl looked over at me. They're planning to move on Saturday. Nicole heard Preston say, Saturday morning, I said. Frank nodded like he was checking off a list. Then Thursday gives us plenty of time to lay out a complete evidence package for Okafor before they make a move. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Go home tonight, Jean. Same as last night. Same as the night before. I know what I'm asking of you. You keep asking because it's still the right play, I said, grabbing my coat off the back of the chair. Frank almost smiled. Almost. I'll have the full briefing ready for Okafor Thursday morning. Every document, every timestamp, every photo organized so the story tells itself without anyone needing to explain a thing. He walked us to the door. Over the next 48 hours, I want you to remember one thing. I turned around. Ray Coulter is experienced at this, Frank said, but experience builds confidence. And confident people stop checking their blind spots. He looked me straight in the eye. He doesn't know you've seen the security feed. He doesn't know about Dot's camera, or Eleanor's notepad, or Nicole's photos. As far as he's concerned, he's got 4 days left and everything is running on schedule. A brief pause. The gap between the truth he thinks he knows and the actual truth is your most valuable asset right now. Don't show your hand early. I followed Carl out into the Wednesday morning. Half a block away, the leaf blower had stopped, and the street was quiet. Thinking of Ray Coulter, sitting somewhere comfortable and confident right now, spending money that wasn't his. A feeling settled in my chest that wasn't quite peace, but was strong enough to hold me up. 48 hours. I could hold out for 48 hours. By Wednesday night, I had been living a double life for 48 hours. I felt a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. I pulled into the driveway at 5:52 p.m., just like any other weekday evening. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see the blue flicker of the TV screen. Lorraine's car was parked in her spot. Everything looked identical to 10,000 nights before. That was what wore on me the most. Not the anger, not the grief, but the seamless, ordinary routine of it all. A life rotting away right under the surface. I pushed open the front door and hung my coat on the hook. You're back. Lorraine's voice came from the kitchen, warm and unhurried. I was just wondering if you'd slipped off to grab groceries without me. Just a little backup on Briley Parkway. I walked into the kitchen to find her at the counter, slicing tomatoes for a salad. Her reading glasses were resting next to a half-empty glass of iced tea on the cutting board. She looked comfortable. She looked like a woman with nothing on her mind beyond getting dinner ready. I washed my hands at the sink, dried them on the dish towel, and said, "Smells good," because something was baking in the oven, and it genuinely did. Saying the words cost me nothing except the effort it took to keep a smile on my face. My chicken casserole, another 40 minutes. She pushed the tomatoes aside and started on a cucumber. How was your day? Quiet, I said. Ran a few errands. Hung out at Carl's shop for a bit. How's Carl? Same as ever. Complaining about his back while fixing everyone else's cars. I sat at the kitchen table and picked up a stack of the day's mail Lorraine had left there. One of 10,000 small ordinary habits from 24 years of marriage. An electric bill, a furniture catalog, a postcard from a real estate firm offering free home valuations. I set the postcard down carefully and moved to the next envelope. We ate dinner at 6:45 p.m. Lorraine poured sweet tea, and the casserole was good. Simple, honest cooking, the kind she'd always done well. Nidi, we talked about the neighbors next door finally fixing the fence they'd discussed for 3 years, about whether the weather would stay clear over the weekend, and about a movie she'd seen an ad for that she thought we might like. I said it sounded nice. I asked if she wanted to go see it Saturday or Sunday. She said Saturday might be tough, as she thought she had a few errands to run. No problem, I said. Sunday works fine. She smiled and reached for her tea. I stared at her face, seeing nothing beyond a woman enjoying her dinner. I remembered what Frank had said, experience builds confidence. I understood completely now. Lorraine had been confident for so long that she had stopped being careful altogether. After dinner, I did the dishes while she went into the living room. At 8:15 p.m., I told her my knee was aching and that I was going to take a shower and get an early night. She said, "Hope you get a good sleep." Was she being sincere, or was it part of the act? I couldn't tell anymore, and I stopped trying to figure it out. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room, pulling the second phone Carl had left in my glove box Monday afternoon from my jacket pocket. A prepaid burner containing no numbers except Carl's and Frank's, and a voice recorder app Carl had already opened and set to ready. He'd handed it to me in the Mapco parking lot before I even had to ask, just like he'd brought the work gloves. Because Carl Hutchkins had been my friend for 30 years and knew how to think ahead for the people he cared about. I laid it on the nightstand, lay flat on the bedspread, set my primary phone on my chest, and stared at the ceiling. At 9:47 p.m., the phone rang. The screen showed Preston. A photo I'd taken 3 years ago at Christmas when his grandmother made him laugh. I let it ring once. Then I picked up the burner phone, started the recorder, laid it screen down on the nightstand so the microphone could capture both sides of the conversation, and answered my primary phone. "Hey, son." "Hey, Dad." His voice carried a caution I wouldn't have picked up on 2 weeks ago. Too guarded, too breezy. The tone of a man trying hard to sound natural. Just calling to check in. "Haven't talked to you in a couple days." "Doing fine," I said. "Knees acting up a bit, staying in mostly." Oh, a half-second pause. "You home for the evening?" There it was. Tossed out casually, like a sharp blade hidden inside a soft sponge. Just a son asking about his father's schedule. "Pretty much," I said. "You know me. Don't go out much on weekday nights these days. Old man habits." I kept my tone light, warm, carrying the slight tiredness of a man with an aching knee getting ready for bed. "How was your flight back from Denver? Your mother said it was smooth." "Yeah, it was fine." Another pause, a fraction longer this time. "You got plans for the weekend?" "Nothing special. Might take a drive Saturday if the weather holds." "Why, you coming over?" "Maybe Sunday," he said. "We'll see how things look." Doors always open. I meant it. Even now, even with the burner phone recording every word. You know that. I know. His voice shifted slightly at those words. Something I couldn't quite read leaked through. Not pure guilt. Something more complex and sadder than guilt. Anyway, just wanted to check in. Glad you called. That was true too, even if it hurt. Give Nicole my best? Yeah. A beat of silence. I will. Night, Dad? Night, Preston. The line went dead. I reached over, stopped the recording on the burner phone, and sent the audio file to Frank's number with a text. Wednesday, 9:47 p.m. Asked if I was home for the evening and if I had weekend plans. Frank's reply came back within 3 minutes, brief as expected. Good job. Get some sleep. I set both phones on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd slept in for 24 years. Down the hall, Lorraine was watching TV, the volume low, the background laughter rising and falling in the quiet house. My son had called to make sure I'd be home Saturday morning. I closed my eyes, remembering a little boy who used to crawl into this bed during thunderstorms because he was scared. I pushed that memory down deep, where it couldn't get in the way of what I had to do. I lay in the dark and waited quietly for Thursday. The photos arrived Thursday morning at 7:23 a.m. I was sitting in my truck in the MAPCO parking lot on Donaldson Pike. The same lot where all of this had started 3 days ago. It felt either like a coincidence or the universe completing a circle. 11 photos in total. Nicole had taken pictures of every single page in the folder, each one clear and readable. Her hand had been steady, telling me she had taken the time to do it right. The first 3 pages were the listing agreement for the house on Elmwood Drive, the signature on the owner line, a passable imitation of my handwriting. It might fool a busy clerk, but it wouldn't last 30 seconds under a handwriting expert's eye. Pages 4 through 7 were financial transfer documents, each bearing a signature for my supposed authorization to transfer funds I'd never approved. Pages 8 through 11 were correspondence between Dale Corbin at the brokerage and Ray Coulter, discussing the timeline for the property sale and what Corbin called the transition of remaining liquid assets upon closing. I read that phrase twice. The transition of remaining liquid assets, wrapping the mechanics of theft in the language of legitimate finance. I forwarded all 11 images to Frank with a note from Nicole, exactly as she described, and then his reply came 4 minutes later. This is the last piece. Come to the office. I was already pulling out of the parking lot. When Carl and I arrived, Frank had everything laid out across the conference table. Not the categorized piles from the last 3 days, but a carefully arranged visual sequence. Every document and photo was positioned in the order a detective should encounter them if seeing it for the first time. Frank had a focused energy about him, the look of a man who had been up since 5 a.m. and found exactly what he was looking for. Sit, he said, without looking up from the table. I want to run you through this before Okafor gets here. She's coming here? Carl asked. 11 o'clock. Frank straightened a photo and stepped back to look at the whole table. I asked her to meet us here instead of at the precinct. I want her to see this as a complete narrative in the sequence I've arranged, not a piecemeal list of complaints. He finally looked up at me. You holding up? Ask me again at noon, I said. He almost smiled. Fair enough. He took us through the evidence package in the order he'd arranged it. The footage from my system, living room, garage, timestamps intact. Then the footage from Dot's USB drive, clearly showing Chuck Merritt's face and hands. Then Eleanor's notepad with the 3 dates and the neat Georgia license plate number. Then the bank records. 14 months of structured withdrawals, the Chattanooga account in Patricia Will's name, and the elements of identity fraud. Then, the property listing agreement with the forged signature. Then, Ray Coulter's criminal record in Georgia. Then, the recorded phone call from Preston on Wednesday night. Finally, Frank had printed out the 11 photos Nicole sent, placing them at the end of the sequence like a period, at the end of a long sentence. Every piece connects to the next, Frank said, standing at the head of the table. No gaps, no assumptions. A detective can follow this from start to finish without needing anyone to explain a thing. He looked at me. This is what you want when you walk into a legal proceeding. A story that tells itself. Detective Sarah Okafor arrived at 11:05 a.m. She was in her mid-40s. Sharp and trimmed down to the essentials. The kind of person who'd learned early in her career that being underestimated was an advantage worth cultivating. She wore plain clothes, dark trousers, a gray jacket, and carried a paper notebook instead of a tablet, showing she'd been in the job long enough to trust paper over batteries. She greeted me with a firm, brief handshake, introduced herself to Carl the same way, then turned to the conference table and began to read. She didn't say a word for 11 full minutes. She moved along the table at her own pace, picking up documents, examining photos, and placing them back in their exact spots. When she got to the recorded phone call, she looked up at Frank. He handed her a pair of headphones. She listened, set them back on the table, and read through to the end. Then she turned around and looked me straight in the eye. "Mr. Stafford," she said, "how long have you known about this?" "Since Monday morning," I said. 4 days. A subtle shift went across her face. Not quite surprise, more like a reevaluation. "And, in 4 days you put all of this together without alerting the targets?" Frank told me not to make a move until I saw the whole board. She glanced at Frank with a look of professional respect. Good advice. She turned back to the table and tapped the Georgia criminal history document. I know this case. Didn't handle it personally, but it had a reputation. The detective in Cobb County who worked it is named Pruitt. She's been waiting 4 years for Coulter to surface again. She looked at me squarely. She's going to want in on this. Works for me, I said. Okafor nodded, already writing in her notebook. Here's what happens next. This afternoon, I bring this package back to my lieutenant. Based on what's here, I expect we'll have arrest warrants for Coulter and Merritt by Friday evening. The physical evidence alone supports criminal charges, while the financial paper trail covers additional counts of fraud and conspiracy. She paused. The forged signature is a separate matter that will be handed over to the DA's office for additional charges. What about Saturday? Carl asked. They're planning to move Saturday morning. If the warrants come through Friday, like I expect, they won't make it to Saturday. Okafor closed her notebook. But I need you to get through tomorrow, staying exactly as you are. Same routine, same demeanor, zero contact with your wife or son about any of this. She looked at me with a direct, unvarnished gaze. The look of someone who had delivered hard instructions to people in tough spots before. Can you hold out one more day? I've held out 4, I said. Then give me one more. She grabbed her jacket off the back of a chair. Mr. Stafford, I want you to know something. She stopped at the door. In 11 years handling financial crimes, I can count on one hand the number of civilian-assembled cases I've seen brought in this clean, this fast. She paused. You didn't panic. That matters more than people think. She left, and the room went quiet for a moment. Carl leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath that seemed to come from deeper than his lungs. "One more day," he said. "One more day," I agreed. I drove through the Thursday afternoon Nashville traffic, taking Briley Parkway to Ellington Parkway, back onto the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house my parents built in 1971. The rose bushes along the east wall, the front faux steps my father poured himself. Nobody was taking this house. I got out of the truck, walked up the steps, and pushed open the door. At 6:41 Friday evening, right as I was rolling the recycling bins down to the curb, Frank called. "Warrants came through," he said. "Both Coulter and Merritt. Okafor's team is moving first thing in the morning." Standing on the driveway with a bin in each hand, the October air biting cold, I asked, "What time?" "Around 8:30 a.m. She wants you home, acting completely normal. Don't leave the house before 9. "Understood. Jean." He paused, that careful, deliberate silence he uses when picking his words. "Tomorrow is going to get loud. It's going to move fast. And it might feel like chaos, even though it's under complete, professional control. Let Okafor handle it. Stay out of the way." "Can you do that?" "I ran job sites for 30 years, I said. "I know how to step aside when pros are working." "Good." Another pause. "Get some sleep." I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark beside Lorraine, listening to her breathe. She was sound asleep, one hand tucked under her pillow as always. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the morning ahead, caught between fear and relief. At 5:15 a.m., I gave up on sleep, dressed quietly in the dark, and went downstairs to brew coffee. In the morning quiet, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and reading the local paper. The house was wrapped in that particular stillness that only exists before the rest of the world wakes up. The kitchen looked like it always did. My mother's Dutch oven on the back burner from last night's soup, the dish towel folded over the oven handle, Lorraine's little ceramic bowl for her keys by the window. 24 years of an ordinary life, arranged like a set on a stage. I drank my coffee and waited. Lorraine came downstairs at 7:40 a.m. in her robe, looking surprised to see me at the table. "You're up early," she said, heading for the coffee maker. "Knie was acting up," I said. "Couldn't sleep. You ought to call Dr. Hendricks." She poured her cup and leaned against the counter. "You've been complaining about that knee for 2 months. I'll call Monday," I said. She nodded, looking out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree, at the flower beds. Her expression was that of a woman already looking past the place she was standing in. I could see it clearly now, though 2 weeks ago I wouldn't have noticed a thing. That subtle distance in her eyes, the way she held her cup, like her mind was already somewhere else. At 8:15 a.m., she said she was going to take a shower. I nodded. At 8:32 a.m., the doorbell rang. I set my cup down, pushed back my chair, and walked toward the front door. Through the narrow window beside the door, I saw Detective Okafor standing on the porch in her gray jacket. Behind her were 2 uniformed officers, with a third detective in plainclothes holding a radio down by the steps. Parked at the curb were 2 Metro Nashville cruisers and an unmarked sedan. I opened the door. "Mr. Stafford," Okafor said, her tone level and professional. "Is your wife home and upstairs?" I told her she'd just stepped into the shower. "We'll wait." She stepped inside, the 2 officers following close behind. She swept the entryway with a quick, practiced gaze, taking in the layout instantly. "Frank Delgado is on his way. Should be here within 10 minutes. All right. How are you holding up?" I thought about the question, about the way she asked it, not as small talk, but as a genuine check on my state of mind. "I'm still standing," I said. "That's enough." She nodded, accepting that. We waited. The house made its usual noises. The hum of the furnace, the cycle of the fridge, the faint sound of running water. From the upstairs shower. One officer stood near the foot of the stairs, while the other walked quietly through the lower rooms, touching nothing, just establishing a presence. Okafor stood near the door, opening her notebook. At 8:47 a.m., the water stopped. A minute later, footsteps came down the stairs. Lorraine appeared at the bottom of the landing, wrapped in her bathrobe, her hair still wet. When she saw the police, she froze, her hand instinctively pulling the collar of her robe tight. "What?" Her eyes darted from the officers to Okafor, finally landing on me. I watched the color drain from her face, slow and terrible. "Jean, what is this, Mrs. Stafford?" Okafor stepped forward. "I'm Detective Sarah Okafor, with Metro Nashville Police. I have a search warrant and need your cooperation regarding an ongoing financial crimes investigation. I'll need you to remain here while my colleagues execute related arrest warrants." "Arrest?" Lorraine's voice turned thin and sharp. "Arrest who?" Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She stared across the room at it, something shifting behind her eyes. A flash of panic, quickly contained. She looked back at me, her eyes finally piecing together what kind of morning this really was. "Jean." Her voice cracked down the middle. "Jean, please tell me what's going on." I looked at the woman I'd been married to for 24 years. The woman who'd cooked with my mother's Dutch oven, talked about painting the front porch, squeezed my arm in the dark hallway, and listed my house for sale behind my back. I looked at her, feeling the weight of the last 5 days settle on my shoulders. I kept my voice steady, telling her the plain truth. "The truth is happening, Lorraine," I said. "It just took a little time to catch up." She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking as tears welled up in her eyes. She turned her face toward the kitchen window, looking out at the garden she'd planted, at the yard she'd planned to leave behind. Outside, on the driveway, Carl's pickup pulled in right behind Frank's car. And somewhere in the city, a phone belonging to Ray Coulter was ringing unanswered. Because Ray Coulter was already standing on his own doorstep in handcuffs. The morning had arrived. 30 seconds after Okafor gave him a slight nod from the porch. Frank walked through the front door, with Carl right behind him. Suddenly my living room, a room where I'd watched countless football games, read decades of Sunday papers, and dozed off in my chair on 100 quiet nights, was filled with people, purpose, and a quiet, controlled energy. Lorraine stood at the bottom of the stairs, wet hair, bathrobe, hands still pressed over her mouth. Her gaze moved from Frank to Carl, and back to me. It was a look I'd never seen on her face before. Not just guilt, but something far more primal. The look of a woman watching the ground beneath her feet vanish into thin air. "Mrs. Stafford," Okafor's voice was firm but not unkind, "I need you to take a seat. We have some questions. And I want you to understand that you have the right to an attorney present before answering." Lorraine lowered her hand. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice steadying just enough to show she was trying to pull herself together. Chin up, shoulders straight. That outer shell she'd worn for longer than I realized slipped right back into place. "You certainly may," Okafor said. "That is your right." While Lorraine went into the kitchen to call her lawyer, an officer standing guard in the hallway, Okafor pulled Frank aside to speak in low tones by the front door. Carl came over and stood beside me. He didn't say a word, just stood there solid and present, the way he'd been since Monday morning. I didn't have the words to tell him what that meant to me. At 9:22 a.m., the front door opened again. Preston walked in. The moment he saw the police, he stopped dead 2 steps into the entryway. The color drained from his face. So fast he looked like a man realizing the full distance between where he thought he was and where he actually stood. He caught my eye from across the room. What I saw wasn't the cold detachment he'd shown over the last year. It was pure, unadulterated fear. "Dad," his voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, what?" Preston, Okafor stepped toward him. "I'm Detective Okafor with Metro Police. I need you to step inside and sit down." He did. He sat on the sofa, hands pressed flat against his knees, staring fixedly at the floor between his feet. 30 seconds later, Nicole appeared in the doorway behind him. She must have been waiting in the car and followed him up. The moment she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, 2 lines running straight down her cheeks. She pressed her lips tight and held her head high, holding herself together. I walked across the room and gave her hand a brief squeeze. "You did the right thing." I kept my voice low so only she could hear. "No matter what comes next, you did the right thing." She nodded, unable to speak, and squeezed my hand hard before letting go. Okafor managed the room with quiet efficiency. Lorraine's attorney arrived at 9:45 a.m., a man in weekend clothes, clearly pulled away from whatever he'd been doing. After a brief private conversation, Lorraine agreed to answer questions voluntarily. She sat at the kitchen table with her lawyer beside her and Okafor across from her. From where I stood in the doorway, I could hear the outline of the conversation. Okafor asked about Ray Coulter, how they met, how long they'd known each other, and whether Lorraine knew about his prior record in Georgia. That last question caused the first real crack in Lorraine's composure. Her lawyer laid a hand on her arm, and she shook her head slowly. When she spoke, her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. "He told me he was a financial advisor," she said. "He told me he specialized in helping people in difficult situations restructure their assets." She paused. "He told me you'd never find out." Those words landed in the kitchen like lead. I turned back to the living room. Preston was still on the sofa, Nicole sitting beside him now, her hand on his back. Frank sat in the armchair across from them, silent and watchful. Preston's hands were still clamped on his knees, his shoulders hunched inward, looking just like he did at 12 years old when he'd broken a garage window with a baseball and knew he had to tell me. When I stepped into the room, he looked up. "I didn't know about the package," he said, his voice cracking on the last word as he swallowed hard. "Dad, I swear I didn't know what Chuck was putting under your truck. Ray said it was just, he said, we were just trying to push you to sign a settlement faster. He said no one would get hurt." His eyes were bloodshot. His jaw twitched as he fought to hold back tears. That morning at the airport, I walked in, went straight to the restroom near the entrance, and slipped out the side door. "Ray told me I had to make sure you were really gone from the neighborhood." His voice broke completely. "I signed the listing papers. I helped transfer funds between accounts, because Mom said it was just restructuring. But I truly didn't know about the package. I didn't know it was a crime. I didn't know Ray had done this before." "I know," I said. He jerked his head up, clearly not expecting that response. "I know you didn't know everything," I said. "That doesn't excuse what you did, Preston. Not by a long shot, but I know." His jaw quivered. A single, uncontrollable tremor. Then the composure he'd been clinging to crumbled entirely. He bent forward, burying his face in his knees, covering his face with both hands. Itidi tune. The sound that came out of him was the sob of a 31-year-old man, watching the gap between who he thought he was and what he'd actually done collapse into a single, unbearable point. Nicole rubbed slow circles on his back, looking over his head at me with a steady gaze. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, enduring strength. By 11:15 a.m., both Ray Coulter and Chuck Merritt were in custody. Confirmation came through Okafor's radio in brief words. Both suspects secured. She passed the word to Frank, who passed it to me with a nod so subtle most people would have missed it. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. At the oak tree, the flower beds, and the rose bushes my mother had planted along the east wall 54 years ago, still holding on to their last bit of color, even in late October. Nobody was taking this house. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early November, I put on the blue button-down shirt my father had given me for Christmas before he passed, and drove down to the Davidson County Courthouse on James Robertson Parkway. The leaves along the parkway had turned entirely to gold and rust red, the kind of colors that usually last about 2 weeks in Nashville before the wind sweeps them away. The morning was cold, my breath showing in white puffs as I stepped out of the truck. I stood in the parking garage for a moment in my coat, keys in hand, taking in the quiet of the concrete building. Frank met me at the courthouse entrance at 8:45 a.m., holding 2 cups of coffee in a tray. The closest thing to a sentimental gesture I'd seen from him in 2 weeks of prep work. He handed me one without a word. "How are you feeling?" he asked, walking alongside me. "Ready to get this over with," I said. "By this afternoon," he said, "it will be." The courtroom was a high-ceilinged, plain room on the 4th floor, lit by bright fluorescent lights. The wooden benches were worn smooth from decades of people waiting for their lives to be sorted out. Carl was already there, sitting in the 2nd row. He'd taken a spot he knew I wouldn't occupy, since Frank had placed me at the petitioner's table. As I walked in, Carl caught my eye and gave me a simple nod that carried all the meaning in the world. Dot was there too, wearing a burgundy dress, hands folded in her lap, sitting straight up in her seat. The way she sat when she felt an occasion deserved her best. Eleanor Stubbs sat beside her in a wool coat, her library book tucked into her bag, because Eleanor never went anywhere without something to read. The 2 women leaned together, whispering softly, bringing a brief smile to Dot's face. Ray Coulter and Chuck Merritt weren't in this courtroom. Their criminal proceedings were being handled separately. Ray was facing conspiracy, frogs, wire fraud, and unlawful property transfer charges. That detective from Cobb County Frank had mentioned had shown up in Nashville 2 weeks ago with 4 years of evidence in tow. Chuck Merritt faced trespassing, conspiracy, and possession with intent to distribute. The lab results on the package from under my truck had come back 10 days ago, confirming what Carl and I had already guessed in that MAPCO lot. When taken in for their preliminary hearings, neither man would meet anyone's eye. The look of men who knew they were out of moves. This courtroom was for civil matters, divorce, assets, the final accounting of a 24-year marriage. Lorraine and her attorney walked in at 9:02 a.m. She looked smaller than I remembered, though her height hadn't changed. What had shifted was her posture. The composure that had once seemed effortless was still there, but maintaining it was clearly taking a heavy toll. You could see the strain in her face. She didn't look at me as she sat down, and I didn't look at her. We both stared straight ahead, waiting for the judge. Preston and his attorney entered through a side door. He was cooperating fully with both the civil and criminal proceedings. Frank had negotiated carefully on his behalf. In exchange for complete testimony and full cooperation, the DA's office had agreed to consider reduced charges regarding the forged documents. He sat on the opposite side from Lorraine, showing where things stood between mother and son over the past 3 weeks. Nicole sat in the third row of the gallery. When I turned to look, she gave me a small, firm nod. Judge Margaret Caldwell took the bench at 9:15 a.m. A woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, she carried a calm, unhurried authority, the kind of presence earned by presiding over enough human wreckage to be neither shocked nor hardened by it. She reviewed the case file in complete silence for 2 minutes, then took off her glasses and looked at both tables. "It appears," she said, "this matter is remarkably straightforward." For a judge like her, straightforward meant a clear, undeniable outcome. "I have reviewed the evidence package submitted by petitioner's counsel. I have questions for both parties, but I want to begin with the asset records." And she did. For the next 40 minutes, Judge Caldwell went through every single item Frank had put together: bank transfers, the Chattanooga account, the property listing, the forged signatures, even an invoice for work on a cabin I'd never seen. She asked her questions in plain, precise language, looking for facts, not drama. And she got facts. Frank had prepared for every question she raised, and even a few she didn't ask. When Dot took the stand, she was exactly as I knew she'd be. Clear, specific, unshakable. She described what she'd seen that Monday morning, without exaggeration or hesitation. When Lorraine's attorney suggested she might have misconstrued what she saw, Dot looked at him with the patience of a woman who had cleaned houses for 40 years and seen every side of human nature. "I know what I saw," she said. "I wrote it down that very morning while it was fresh, and that notebook is right here in my purse if you'd care to look at it." Lorraine's attorney didn't ask to see the notebook. Eleanor testified next, her dates and license plate numbers entering the court record with quiet authority. A woman who had spent 31 years watching her street, knowing exactly what belonged and what didn't. Then Frank submitted the audio recording of the phone call. Preston's voice echoed through the courtroom. The careful questions about my schedule, the casual inquiries about my weekend plans. I watched Judge Caldwell's face as she listened. What I saw wasn't surprise, but recognition. A woman who had heard 100 variations of this story and knew its shape from the very first note. When the testimony concluded, Judge Caldwell removed her glasses and laid them on the bench. "In 27 years on the bench," she said, "I have seen marriages break down in every imaginable way. What I see far less often," she paused, "is the degree of premeditation documented in this case. This was not a failing marriage. This was a systematic dismantling carried out by people who assumed they wouldn't be caught." She looked at Lorraine's table, then at Preston's. They were wrong. Reading the ruling took 18 minutes. Full restoration of all transferred funds, including the balance of the Chattanooga account. The property listing declared null and void, the forged authorization invalidated. The marital home awarded entirely to Jean Stafford. Given the nature of the misconduct, Lorraine was ordered to pay the majority of the legal fees. Preston's cooperation was formally noted on the record, along with a recommendation from the court to the district attorney's office for consideration during sentencing. When Judge Caldwell finished, Frank reached out and laid a hand on my forearm for a brief second. Then he adjusted his suit jacket and began gathering his papers. never one to linger longer than necessary. I sat in that smooth wooden chair, letting the outcome wash over me, feeling a heavy weight I'd carried for a very long time finally slip from my shoulders. Through the tall windows, the November Nashville sky showed a pale, clean blue. That brief, clear window between the fall leaves fading and the gray of winter setting in. I picked up my coffee cup. It was cold, but I drank it anyway. The hallway outside the fourth-floor courtroom was long and high-ceilinged, with tall windows at the end, letting in a sheet of pale November sunlight. The building was old enough that the floors were real marble, worn down in the center from decades of foot traffic. The courtroom door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing before fading into quiet. Preston was standing at the far end of the hall. He was alone, his lawyer already gone. Standing with his back to the window, hands at his sides, he wasn't looking at his phone or anything in particular. He just stood there in the sunlight, looking like a man who realized he had nowhere left to run. He saw me the moment I stepped out. He didn't walk toward me, just stood his ground and waited. That detail, the fact that he waited without rushing forward or trying to put on an act, told me that whatever he had to say wasn't rehearsed. I walked down the hall toward my son, stopping at a distance where we could speak without raising our voices. In the pale sunlight, we looked at each other. I saw the bone-deep exhaustion in his face, the kind that comes from living inside a bad decision. So long you forget what making a good one feels like. His eyes were swollen. He'd been crying, probably quietly in the courtroom, the way men do when they're trying not to be seen. "Dad." His voice was rough and stripped of all pretense, leaving only what remained when everything else was gone. "I don't know where to start." "You don't need a starting point," I said. "Just tell the truth." He pressed his lips tight, his jaw working for a moment. "I let Mom convince me you'd never find out, that you'd just go along with it like you went along with everything else." He took a breath, letting it out with a slight tremble. Then, when I was too far in to pull back, Ray made it clear that if I didn't stick with it, he'd make sure the forgery charges fell squarely on me. Tears filled his eyes. "I told myself it wasn't really hurting you. I told myself you'd be fine in the end." On that last word, his voice cracked completely. I knew it was a lie. I knew it the whole time. An ache went through my chest, having nothing to do with age or the weather. "Preston," I said. He looked up at me. "You were my boy. From the day you were born, you were the thing I was proudest of. Not because of anything you did, just because you were here." I kept my voice as steady as I could, knowing I wouldn't finish the thought if I let it slip. "What you did over these last few months was wrong. It's going to take a long, long time to work through, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's all right. But you're still my son. That part doesn't change." Preston's face broke completely. Not the controlled, quiet grief from the courtroom, but a raw, honest weeping that didn't care how it looked. He bent forward, slightly, covering his mouth with one hand, his shoulders shaking. "I did what a father does even when he's hurting himself. I put my hand on the back of his neck, just like I used to when he was little, and needed to know something solid was there. We stood like that for a long time in that courthouse hallway, surrounded by marble floors, November light, and the worn groove down the center of the floor. Then he straightened up, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and took a deep, uneven breath. "I'm going to make this right," he said. "However long it takes. Whatever it costs." "I know you will," I said, meaning it and full trust would take time to become the same thing again. Nicole stepped around the corner, having waited at a respectful distance. She looked from Preston to me, reading the moment with quiet accuracy. She walked up without a word and took Preston's arm, and he leaned into her slightly. Whatever lay ahead for the two of them, at least they had each other, and they'd made the honest choice when it mattered most. "Thank you, Nicole," I said. "For everything." She shook her head slightly, then paused. "Thank you for not giving up on him," she said softly, "even when you had every reason to." Carl was waiting by the elevator, hands shoved into his jacket pockets with the patience of a man who understood that important things took time. As I walked up, he searched my face, nodding with quiet satisfaction at whatever he saw. "Hungry?" he asked. "Starving," I realized it was true. Dot's at the diner on Church Street. Called 20 minutes ago and ordered for both of us because she said we'd take too long to decide. He pressed the elevator button. "Ordered you turkey and dressing. Said you needed a hot meal." Something tight in my chest loosened. Not breaking or vanishing, just easing up. Like a knot held tight for a long time, finally getting room to breathe. I laughed, a real, brief laugh from deep down, a little rough around the edges. My first real laugh in 2 weeks. "Of course she did," I said. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. They closed on the 4th floor of the Davidson County Courthouse. Closing on the marble hallway, the November light, everything that had happened, and everything left to face. Dot had ordered turkey and dressing. Carl was hungry. The leaves on James Robertson Parkway were gold and rust red, and almost completely gone. For today, that was enough. It was more than enough. Looking back now, I understand things I couldn't see while sitting in that truck in the MAPCO parking lot, feeling the world tilt on its axis. I spent 24 years trusting completely, while seeing nothing, telling myself that was love. Maybe it was. But I learned a hard lesson. Love without attention is just an unlocked door, left open for anyone who decides to walk in. If I have anything to say to anyone listening, it's this. Don't be like me. Don't hand over the keys to your financial life and look away for decades just because it feels like trust. Real trust doesn't require you to stop paying attention. Check your accounts. Know what you own. Know what the wealth you built is being used for. The people who truly love you won't mind, and the ones who do mind will tell you everything you need to know. I believe God puts the right people in the right places at the right time. Dot was standing on that porch for a reason. Carl Hutchkins answered on the first ring for a reason. Eleanor Stubbs wrote down that license plate for a reason. When this situation could have gone a completely different way. When I could have been the one in handcuffs on a Saturday morning. Something far larger than my own planning kept that from happening. I don't take that lightly. This is my family's story, and I'm not proud that it happened. But I'm grateful for what it taught me. Truth is patient. It doesn't need your help to survive. It just needs time. If this story touched a nerve, if you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved, drop a comment below and tell me how you made it through. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what's coming next. To everyone who walked through this story with me to the end, thank you. It means more than you know. The next story we share will contain elements fictionalized purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not the journey you're looking for today, feel free to step away and find what speaks to you. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.